So from the time of you doing Citizen4, sitting down with him, to now, how much progress have we made, or how much progress has CIA, FBI, NSA made on being able to control what we're doing?
It's one of the things we saw, at the time we did this reporting, and it's kind of assumed now that the CIA and the FBI and the NSA spy on everybody. At the time, some people had suspicions of it, but there was no evidence to prove it. A lot of those of us who were saying that it was happening were called conspiracy theorists, precisely because it was all done in the dark with no evidence. That's what made Edward Snowden heroic, is he came forward with the evidence to prove it. So there was a huge movement in the year, 18 months following these revelations for bipartisan reining in of the NSA, the idea that the U.S. security state was never supposed to be turned inward onto the United States, onto American citizens. It was supposed to be directed outward. There was legislation that was co-introduced by Justin Amash, who at the time was considered this far-right Tea Party conservative from Michigan, who co-sponsored it with John Conyers, who was like the liberal lion of the House. So it was very bipartisan. It was on its way to passing. It would have been the first ever piece of legislation to rein in the powers of the security state after 9/11, as opposed to expand them. The White House, the Obama White House, was adamantly opposed, got Nancy Pelosi to whip enough votes just at the last second to defeat it narrowly. There's a Foreign Affairs article that says how Nancy Pelosi saved the NSA, which is exactly what happened. And then ever since then, the U.S. security state, which is very adept at inventing new enemies, started, kind of Al-Qaeda at that point was sort of tired. People weren't that scared anymore by Al-Qaeda. It had been 12 years since the 9/11 attack. Suddenly it was ISIS for a year and a half or two that got people scared enough to want more security. And then into 2016, Russia arrived and has become the preeminent enemy now that makes all American liberals practically, by polling data, love the NSA, love the CIA. And so a lot of this has gone backward, actually, because they're very good at propaganda, at keeping Americans afraid enough to wanting those sorts of authorities to grow in the name of keeping them safe.
And it's funny you say that, because what's the last thing he says? One of the last things he says in the interview, Snowden says, in the months ahead, the years ahead, it's only going to get worse until eventually there will be a time where policies will change, because the only thing that resists the activities of the surveillance state are policy. Even our agreements with other sovereign governments, we consider that to be a stipulation of policy rather than a stipulation of law. And because of that, a new leader will be elected. Last part of this short clip. They will find the switch, say that because of the crisis, because of the dangers we face in the world, some new and unpredictable threat, we need more authority, we need more power, and there will be nothing the people can do at that point to oppose it, and it will be turnkey tyranny. Do you think that's already happened with COVID and Biden?
I think we're very close to that point. I think that the quick history, if I can just give it to you because it's so fascinating and relevant, which was in the 1970s, after Watergate, that was the first time Congress ever began investigating, like, hey, what did these agencies actually do? These agencies created after World War II with the National Security Act in 1947. There was no CIA, in the 1920s. It was all created in the 1940s and 50s. And it was all so secret. The joke was the NSA stood for no such agency. So they had this church committee that was a group of bipartisan members of the Senate that investigated what these agencies were doing and uncovered things that shocked them. The idea that we now have the capacity to spy on every American citizen. And the head of the committee was this guy named Frank Church. He was like this liberal Democrat from Idaho, but he was one of those, because he was from Idaho, he was a civil libertarian. And what he said was, this system is so ubiquitous and so omnipotent that if it's ever turned inward on the American people, because at the time the idea was still, it was a taboo to turn it inward domestically, the American people will have no place to hide. There will be no possibility left of resisting the government because there will be nowhere to go to be monitored. He obviously didn't envision the internet, the surveillance capabilities that produces, which is in a whole different universe. Every whistleblower after 9/11 became a whistleblower precisely because these instruments now are turned inward. We know that Homeland Security and the CIA considers not ISIS or Al-Qaeda or Russia, but the American people, what they call domestic extremists, to be the number one political threat and the number one threat to our national. So the whole thing is now directed inward, directed internally. That's where censorship comes from. That's where surveillance comes from. We're absolutely very close to the point where we have a system in place where you cannot cross certain lines in terms of opinions you expressed or dissidents that you want to organize without being called extremist and being criminalized. And that kind of turnkey tyranny that really came from the 1970s that Snowden warned about us being closer and closer to, I do think we're now rapidly approximating. And it's the reason why the only cause I really care about at this point is doing anything possible to preserve independent media, to preserve spaces on the internet where independence and true dissent can actually thrive.
For you who's in it, what do you see that as the biggest threat? Like, you know how somebody goes to sleep, they're like, well, I think the biggest threat is, whatever.
Climate change.
Or your biggest threat is the economy collapsing with the debt that we have and what's going to happen if deflation, stagflation, hyperinflation, all these things. You put surveillance as number one for you, or is that just your cause?
Surveillance combined with censorship. Those are because the internet obviously is the most powerful and innovative evolution of our lifetime, without question. And if you go back and read like the triumphalist literature of the 1990s about why the internet was going to be so revolutionary, it was supposed to be a tool of liberation. We can communicate with each other. We can organize without the mediation of a state, centralized state, and corporate authority. What it can also be, though, is the most potent tool ever invented for monitoring and surveilling and then also controlling the thoughts of the domestic population. And that is the turn that it has taken. Look, I spent two and a half years of my life reading through hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of the most sensitive documents produced by the most secretive agency of the world's most powerful government. That's what I did when I got that archive by Edward Snowden. I know what their aspirations are. I know the things they say when they thought nobody would be ever listening and watching. And then I went about publishing them. And their goal is that kind of total and complete control. That is not a sort of dystopian fantasy. It's not a conspiracy that requires. I published the documents demonstrating that that's the thing for which they're aiming. And so it's not just my cause. If we lose the ability to dissent from establishment pieties, which we know are false. We just sat through COVID for 2 years where the pronouncements that came down one after the next, we now know are false. The same is true about the war in Ukraine. The same is true about the financial collapse of 2008, obviously about the war on terror. It's true about every one of our important debates. If we lose the ability to dissent from that meaningfully, meaning not just standing on a street corner on a box, but with the ability to reach people and to organize without being criminalized and monitored, what other political cause is even possible?
What's an appropriate middle ground? Like, what's an appropriate happy medium? So, for example, like you have national security, pretty, especially during 9/11. This whole thing, I appreciate what you're saying during Watergate in the 70s, but there's a lot of people that are Gen Z that basically don't remember anything from that, even millennials. It's all kind of catapulted right after 9/11, George W. Bush, everything with the Patriot Act, government overreach, executive powers, everything with that. So how do you grapple national security, genuinely like trying to save the country from any terrorist attacks or any homegrown terrorists, whatever that is, versus the surveillance state and the intelligence community? There needs to be a happy medium, I would assume. Right?
Yeah, these agencies have a function, and there's a legitimate function in surveillance. Of course, we want our government surveilling people who mean harm to this country. That's one of their top priorities, is keeping people physically safe. There was a balance reached during the Cold War. The Cold War was infinitely more dangerous than the war on terror, and it's obviously infinitely more dangerous than whatever, fears are being cooked up all the time about Russia or even China. You had the United States and the Soviet Union going around the world in multiple proxy wars with tens of thousands of intercontinental ballistic missiles that are nuclear tipped, aimed at one another's cities. You can't get more dangerous than that. And during Ronald Reagan's presidency, when Dwight Eisenhower was overseeing the Cold War, the kind of two bookends, they managed to have a system that preserved that balance, which was, if we want to spy on somebody, we go to a court, we get a warrant, not as high of a warrant as you need for a criminal court because you're spying on foreign nationals. where you essentially say there's a legitimate reason to be spying on these particular groups. You do it in secret if necessary, and the spying is directed. What Snowden's archive revealed is that there's nothing directed about it. It's mass, indiscriminate, suspicionless surveillance on entire populations.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, it's kind of almost to like validate your case. Like part of the Surveillance State Patriot Act, there was something called the Section 215. This is where they said the sneak and peek provision. How familiar with that?
Yeah, well, so look at the Patriot Act. That is the perfect example. In the weeks and months after 9/11 was probably like the most traumatizing time for the country in its history, with the exception of, say, the Civil War and the attack on Pearl Harbor. But it was certainly one of the top three. And people were pretty much willing to give the government anything it wanted in the name of keeping people safe. 3,000 people had just died. The Pentagon was attacked. The World Trade Center collapsed.
It's amazing what fear will do to allow you to basically get infringed on your rights.
Yeah, and that fear was
same with COVID.
I lived in Manhattan. I found that traumatizing, like watching those two buildings collapse on top of 3,000 of my fellow citizens. But even in that climate, the Patriot Act was considered so radical that there was a lot of voices in dissent saying, wait a minute, this seems pretty un-American, this legislation. And in order to justify it, there was a provision that was put into it that said, with all of these powers, don't worry, it's only temporary. It will expire after 4 years. In order for it to be renewed, Congress has to come back and declare a sufficient emergency in order to renew it. People said, okay, we'll accept it only because it's sort of this byproduct of an Okay, here we are 22 years later. No one ever talks about the Patriot Act anymore. Every 4 years it gets renewed without debate. It just falls into the woodwork because it's become normalized. No one thinks the Patriot Act is radical anymore because exactly what you said, every year, more and more Americans don't know a world prior to 9/11, don't know a world in which those liberties existed. They just accept and assume that the way things are the way they've always been and the way that they have to be. And that's the same now with the censorship regime over the internet. More and more people are being born into a world in which it's natural that a tiny number of corporations work in conjunction with the government, the U.S. security state, to determine what can and can't be said on the internet. And polls show that a lot of people want that. In fact, want more of it. And that's what's really alarming, is to see how effective that propaganda is.
Glenn, you said earlier they want surveillance, they want control, they want this. They is a lot of different things, but who is they? Who's at the head of the they?
I think if you look at every society, it's not a conspiratorial theory that there's always a power center, there's an establishment, there's a whatever you want to call it, the people for whom the society functions most profitably, the people who want most to preserve the status quo. And I think what has happened is, if you look in the past, we're a capitalist society. That means there's going to be a lot of wealth inequality. And when there's wealth inequality, there's always the chance that lots of people on the bottom end of that wealth inequality are going to be angry. They're going to start to get agitated. They're going to be rebellious. There's lots of ways to deal with that. You can appease them. You can introduce social programs. You can, keep them just placated enough not to rebel on the street. I think what the choice that our current elite has made instead is, let them be as angry as they want. We'll just paramilitarize the society enough with surveillance, with paramilitarizing our police force, so that any kind of protest effort will be instantly crushed. And the they is nothing more than the people who wield the greatest amount of power in society, the people who are in control of the mechanisms of surveillance, of the security state, of the financial industry, the people who wield power in Washington.
So you're not putting it. The they is the director of CIA, the director of FBI. You're putting all of those guys as part of they. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah,
There's not an individual at the top that all those days call.
Yeah, it's a confluence of power centers that work in conjunction with one another. When I was interviewing Vivek, as I did yesterday, right after that debate, the morning after the debate, one of the things he said, and he didn't have time to elaborate on the debate, but he was saying the only war I want to wage is on the fourth branch of government. We're only supposed to have three. And I asked him, what is the fourth branch of government? And he said the fourth branch of government is the permanent power faction in Washington that exists completely outside democratic accountability, the three-letter agencies, the administrative state. Those people are not there because they've consolidated control. They're serving a part of a broader elite. You know, the people who have an interest in ensuring that the population is kind of tamped down, that the country is sort of controlled, that stability is maintained, that it's impossible to organize in a meaningful way if you're a dissident. And so it's not, that's what I mean. It's not you don't need to imagine a conspiratorial council that meets in some underground lair somewhere. It's not out of a science fiction film. It's just based on how societies function. And that is it, that there is an elite in society, especially one that's unequal. And in those unequal societies, you can have power that starts to get more and more centralized and then more and more abused.
Yeah, but the way I'm thinking about it, like, for example, you watch the other day, Drake did a concert, and he came out of the concert with LeBron and his son, Bronny. Okay. There is alliances being built there, right? Because one of Drake's first songs was about, last name ever, first name, was it last name greatest, first name ever, something like that, right?
Yeah.
And, okay, so he made that song about LeBron, so there's an alliance there. No problem. You watch it in movies, and you'll see, Mel Gibson talking to whoever. You'll see Brad Pitt talking to whoever. There's alliances there, right? Do these guys kind of just watch and say, ooh, that guy's becoming powerful. Let me get a hold of him. Can we go out to dinner together? Hey, what do you think about us doing this together? You think that's what it is? Or do you think it's more the money guys like a Larry Fink or a Soros or the ESG crowd or, the State Street or, the BlackRock and the Vanguards? Or is it more the big media guys? Well, all of this is controlled by Rupert Murdoch and, all these or now it's more the powerful people of the Zuckerbergs and the Sergey and the Bezos and who is the people at the top that truly are able to move it? Is it more political power? Is it more spying power? Is it more money? Which one of those is the most powerful in your eyes?
I think the U.S. government is a government that exists in servitude to economic power.
Servitude towards economic
to
power.
economic power. So you go and talk to any member of Congress who's honest, and they will tell you that most of their time is spent either raising money from big donors or having the lobbyists for big donors write the bills. That is the reality of how most bills in Congress simply come from well-paid lobbyists who work for corporations. Now, again, it's not a totalitarian society where you can identify this one single power center. Right now, look at China, for example. You have different power centers that want different things with regard to China. Wall Street's in bed with China. They don't want antagonism with China. They love having a relationship with China where they put their low-paid, workers in China producing their sneakers and producing their computers and producing their cars, whereas parts of the military-industrial complex seek a Cold War with China and more antagonism toward China. It's an example where there's a kind of conflicting agenda. So you get those often. But in reality, the government itself is a government that is run by the people with the most amount of money, which is essentially oligarchy. And everyone who works inside the government who's honest will tell you that.
Okay. But does it at all interest you to want to know who the guy at the top is? Like, maybe this is just because something that I'm curious about. The movie, again, American Gangster. I'll never forget the scene where they keep thinking the main drug dealer selling blue magic is this Italian guy. And then all of a sudden they're like, no, it's Frank Lucas, and it changes the game, right, with the whole blue magic. Do you have any interest as one of the greatest investigative journalists of our time? Some would put you on the top 5. Some would say the best during our time for what you broke and what you had to tell the story. That guy felt he trusted you more than anybody else to go out there and sit with them, and that came with a lot of risk for you, what you did at a time like that. Does it interest you to find out who is the Frank Lucas of power?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in general, I think the people who are the most powerful are the people who are not very visible. So in the cheapest, most anti-intellectual, crudest form of punditry, they'll refer to Joe Biden as the most powerful person on earth, right? Which is a gigantic joke. And not just because he doesn't know his name or where he is, but because a president is answerable to an enormous number of actual power centers out in whose lines he has to remain. He's not the one setting those lines. He's the one observing those lines. He's a servant to that power. So yeah, of course it interests me. I don't though think there's a kind of, I don't think it's like a pyramid where one person is sitting at the top.
You don't think?
I think that there's a set of power centers, I was with this Republican debate, I'm sure we'll talk about it, but one of the things that fascinated me was, so you have pretty much everybody on that stage, with the exception of Ron DeSantis, sort of, and Vivek completely, but every single other person who's saying we want to support Joe Biden's policy of sending billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars to Ukraine indefinitely to keep that war going. They're saying this notwithstanding the fact that they see the same polling data that I see and that you see, which is that not just Americans as a whole, but conservatives and Republicans in particular are overwhelmingly opposed to that policy. They want no more money going to Ukraine. So the question becomes, why do very competent, smart politicians who rely on public opinion to win nonetheless espouse in public a policy they know most of their voters oppose? And the reason is because the people who are their donors, the people who actually control their candidacy, without which their candidacy cannot exist, favor that policy. And so that's who they're serving. And I think in general, so then the question becomes, well, who is the top donor? Who is like the single guy? I mean, I think there's like a handful of institutions. It's always BlackRock, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan. These are the institutions that are by far the most powerful economic organs. They need and rely on the government. They're constantly working with the government. You have the arms industry, of course, that also wields a lot of that power. So I think it's a small number of power centers that in general have an aligned interest.
Got it. So the way you put it, this is how it makes sense to me on how you're perceiving what's going on there. It's kind of like the Italian mafia many years ago when they came out with the commission. I don't know if you know the whole commission with the five, Gambino, Colombo,
exactly.
Everybody came in and said, hey, guys, let's control the whole thing together. We're going to have to share some of it. And so one of the families, maybe the BlackRock, State Street, one of the families is going to be more the CIA, NSA, FBI. One of the families is going to be more the political power, all those guys. That's kind of how you see that happen.
Because we all benefit more when we're kind of working in confluence as opposed to in conflict.
Then my question for you becomes with that, then my question with that becomes, I'm sorry, you were going to
say, isn't that the definition of an oligarchy?
A
handful of people at the very top running the whole thing.
If you asked me to describe the United States in terms of how it functions with one word, I would pick oligarchy.
So yeah, sorry, Pat.
But here's where I'm going with that. Mm-hmm. So as good as they may be at protecting how they communicate with each other, I'm convinced the best hackers are the ones that don't work for the government. How are the best hackers in the world not hacking into seeing how they communicate with each other to release it to the rest of the world to know what they're saying to each other? The technology exists for them to realize these days when they communicate to decide what's going to happen to the world in the next 10, 20, 40, 50 years. Shouldn't we know about it? Why don't hackers target that? Because once, you know how the WikiLeaks informational leak, we're like, wait, what? Wow, I'm glad I know. Holy shit, so Hillary paid $35 million, so this is this, so that happened over here. That's crazy. Why isn't a certain group of individuals who are hackers come together and say, look, let's kind of find out what these guys are doing. Let's get to the truth of it. We can figure it out. Why don't they do that?
Well, first of all, there has been an amazing recruitment effort, especially in the wake of Snowden, to recruit the top scientific hacking talent into the government with all and I mean, when we talk about the government, so much of what the government is actually the private sector. Snowden worked at the NSA, but his employer was Booz Allen Hamilton. So these companies recruit on behalf of the government with massive private sector pay. So a lot of them have been recruited successfully onto their side, and they also have an unlimited budget because they have the American taxpayer budget, and we spend, $75 billion. At least that's what it was. The last secret budget that I saw is probably $120 billion a year now, and a huge amount goes into defensive hacking skills as well. But you have had hacking into power centers when you've had, the Pandora Papers and the Panama Papers showing how the extremely wealthy keep their money and evade taxes. You've had, obviously, hacks into the Democratic National Committee and Hillary Clinton's campaign. So I don't think there's some secret council where the head of JP Morgan and the head of BlackRock and the head of Raytheon meet at some sort of table sitting around like this and have minutes to the meetings and then keep them secret. And the question is, why don't they leak? It is a good question to ask. Why do we not know more about those kinds of power centers? And I think the reason is because the people whose responsibility would be to do that kind of digging is not the U.S. government who's working for those institutions. It would be media corporations. People like me, investigative journalists, are supposed to be aimed at those power centers. And what we have instead is a media that is not aimed at power centers, but is aimed at working for those power centers as well. So who is it that's going to kind of do that sort of digging? We do know enough. We have gotten enough of a glimpse into how a lot of this works. But we have a media that's designed to obscure it, to distract from it, that's not interested in it, to minimize it, to disparage it. Look at what they did with the Twitter files. You know, we got this, because of Elon Musk opening up the corporate files of Twitter, we got this extraordinary insight into this channel between the CIA, FBI, DHS on the one hand and big tech on the other. And immediately, the employees of the largest media corporations swooped in like they were programmed and reading from the same script, and they all said, this is a nothing burger. Ignore this. There's nothing here of any interest. And when you have the media that corralled and that controlled, even when you do get those glimpses, you can minimize and neutralize them quickly.
So if you like this clip and you want to watch another one, click right here. And if you want to watch the entire podcast, click right here.